Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is that you are. We have panelists in all of those time zones. Welcome to this panel, which is hosted jointly by PRASEG, the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Renewable and Sustainable Energy, and ECIU, the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. First thing to say by way of introduction is I am not Bim Afalami MP, who should have been chairing our session today. Bim, as well as being chair of PRASEG, is a parliamentary private secretary to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and has been called just a couple of hours ago into an unavoidable meeting of some sort that left a gap. And at the best of times, calling around parliamentarians to see if anybody is available at a few hours' notice is challenging, but we are very close to the end of the parliamentary year. And the House of Commons is also preoccupied this afternoon with something very directly relevant to what we're talking about here, to COP and to the credibility of the UK presidency of COP, a vote on restoring the UK's overseas development assistance to 0.7% of GDP rather than cutting it to 0.5%. So I think we can forgive some of our alternative chairs being otherwise engaged. So that's why you've got me. I'm Gareth Redmond-King. I'm the COP26 lead at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. And so with just an hour or so to prepare, I'm your chair. So I say it like that and hope you forgive me any glitches or stumbles in chairing. No such leeway will be needed with our excellent panelists. They join us to look not very far ahead now to just under 4 months to the next UN Climate Summit, COP26, which is being hosted by the UK in Glasgow. We're looking particularly today at some of the risks in terms of blocks and delays to the progress that we hope to see before and at COP26. It's fair to say that not everyone turns up to UN negotiations with the same aims and preferred outcomes. If they did, they would hardly be negotiations at all. But as it is, whilst there are climate leaders and front runners with ambitious targets and bold action to deliver them, there are also countries who have less ambitious targets, much less sign of climate action to deliver them, and in some cases, an agenda to slow or to block progress at all. Our panelists between them have some considerable experience of what this looks like at COPs, what those blocking tactics can look like, and therefore what the UK presidency needs to do, needs to be doing now and at COP to deal with and to respond to those, to give COP26 the very best chance of keeping the Paris Agreement's goals within reach, of delivering momentum to keep 1.5 alive. Let me introduce our panelists and then I can shut up and hand over to them. Firstly, Isabella Teixeira is a former Environment Minister of Brazil from 2010 to 2016, in which role she headed Brazil's delegation to numerous COPs, including, of course, COP21 in Paris. She also served as a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on global sustainability, and she headed the Brazil, South Africa, India, China group at the UNFCCC talks, the BASIC group. She's now co-chair of the UN Environment Programme's International Resource Panel. Second, we have Jimmy Fletcher, another former minister. He served in the government of St. Lucia from 2011 to 2016, including as one of the chief high-level negotiators for the Caribbean and the Association of Small Island States, AOSIS, in the UNFCCC COPs, again, including at Paris, where he worked very closely with the French presidency on tactics to steer agreement through the blockers and delayers back then. He's now managing director of Soloricon Limited, working to build capacity amongst small island developing states. And thirdly, Richie Merzian, who served in roles in the Australian Departments for Climate Change and for Foreign Affairs, including as an Australian government negotiator at COPs, during which time he helped coordinate the Green Climate Fund Board. He was also co-founder of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, and he's now the inaugural Climate and Energy Programme Director at the Australia Institute. That's our panel. They're each going to speak for about 5 minutes or so to give their perspective at the start, and then we'll open up to questions and discussion. Please do put questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. We've already established that I've not had long to prepare, so please don't leave it all to me. Please do ask questions. We want to hear from you and answer your questions. So without any more from me, I'm going to hand over first to Isabella.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me for this opportunity to dialogue with the UK Parliament and also with the public audience. And thank you very much for the opportunity to see my friends again, okay, and to go back to the past with good with positive actions that we had in the past. But let's see, I'd like to add 3 or 4 comments. And of course, that I can discuss Brazil situations later. But we need to consider the process of the political leadership for COP26, the importance to have the spirit of the political willness shared in Paris. Of course, that the world changed, okay, the last 5 to 6 years, but we have political willness in Paris. And it's absolutely important that we can have this in Glasgow under consider the UK leadership, but also who are the key guys that must be engaged as we were in Paris to address concrete solutions and also to promote dialogue. Don't forget it, dialogue that try to understand the demands, try to understand what the real national needs, who are the blockers, indeed, why you have countries that are looking for to block the negotiations. It's very important to facilitate the political dialogue. Second, when you work based on, we need trust, credibility into negotiation. Leadership means this. So it's important that for the international community that you recognize the mistakes in the past. We cannot forget it that to consider developing and emerging economies, what's happened with Kyoto Protocol and also the decision of the developed countries not buy the CDM credits for middle income countries. What it means? It means that in the past, the international community was not able to manage all the requirements of developing countries and emerging economies to address ambition and address concrete solutions, considering that it was not an obligation in the past on the KP, but today it's an obligation considering the Paris Agreement. Second, it's important to understand, indeed, I know that you have Glasgow package. This is very important, that you need to understand the inconsistency of the international cooperation budget. For example, ODA, you cannot cut international funds to address solutions for low-income countries or even to middle-income countries. Or also the green budget promise, like $100 billion on developed economies. I know that UK leadership is fully engaged to address this before the COP. It's absolutely key. It's not 8 million, 7 million. It's important to have $100 billion, okay? It's important to have really a concrete mark that say we are here to address concrete solutions and to have a new momentum of climate agenda in the world. Important to make a differentiation that Brazil have this huge mistake today. Money consider markets, private markets, and money consider public funding. Different things, you cannot bring things, we can bring these things together, but we need to make clear what are the responsibilities, who is in charge, okay? Multilateralism, is important to highlight that multilateralism today goes beyond the government. Okay, it's not on the government. That's why I mentioned dialogue. So COP26, in my personal opinion, means a new beginning, a new momentum of the global multilateralism system considered the climate agenda. Glasgow package, absolutely important to deliver and act, ex ante and ex post. Look, president of COP, it's not during or preparation process or during the COP. After this, it's important that if you achieve good outcome, that you continue to influence countries and consider international cooperation, how we can manage ambition, how you can support countries to address concrete solutions on mitigation and also adaptation. And you cannot forget, my last comment, the trade-offs and what I call the climate shadow agendas. What are the other issues that indeed behind the scenes put pressure on this, like international trade, production and consumption, technology access, new alliance to mitigate carbon emissions that you know these are climate ethics. How indeed do you like to bring these issues? How indeed, don't put this aside. Please define this as real issue that global society wants to discuss and bring a new innovative arrangements, political arrangements to have an open eye, an open agenda to address or to dialogue based on this. We cannot put things aside because this is a special momentum to take decisions to address concrete solutions to run until 2030. This decade is absolutely critical. It's key if you want the transformative global economy based on low carbon, a strategy in the low carbon tracks. So my feeling is that for UK leadership, it's important not only to put the focus on the blockers place. It's important to find how to bring people and things together and to solve what to have the passive of the past considered climate change agenda. small islands, adaptation, green finance. It's absolutely clear. We need transparency to know if we are able to address this issue or not. Don't postpone. This is a critical momentum to be transparent, to make sure that leadership will be able to bring the trade-offs and make clear what are the difficulties that we have today to address the next 8 years. If not, I'm so sorry. Again, it's postpone and postpone and postpone, and you have the countries playing and based on their own interests, not at the global interest that we need to share this. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Isabella. Dialogue, dialogue, dialogue. So for the next stage of that, I'm going to hand over to Jimmy.
Thank you. Thanks, Gareth. I just want to echo everything Isabella said. And Isabella, it's great to see you again after, 2015, after 6 years. COP26 is a very important and urgent one for small island developing states and climate vulnerable countries. You know, since what we've referred to as a triumph of multilateralism, that was the Paris Agreement in COP21, there really has been very little on the climate change front in which SIDS can take much comfort. Our countries have been visited by devastating hurricanes that have caused significant loss of lives, damage to infrastructure and livelihoods, increasingly severe droughts, changes to our marine and our terrestrial ecosystems, increasingly hot days, and continued sea level rise. In fact, just in 2017, Hurricane Maria caused damage in Dominica that was equivalent to 226% of its GDP. I mean, think about that. In the space of 24 hours, a hurricane passes over a Caribbean island and causes damage that's equivalent to 226% of the economic output of that country. And in the BVI that same year, the British Virgin Islands, Hurricane Irma caused damage that was equivalent to 309% of that country's GDP. These hurricanes intensified from a Category 1 to a Category 5 in the space of 24 hours. So the countries did not even have time to prepare for the onslaught that visited them. And that's what climate change is bringing to us. It's bringing to us increasingly severe weather events that we have very little time to prepare for. And the irony of this is that despite contributing less than 0.20% to global greenhouse gases, the Caribbean finds itself at ground zero in a war that it did not provoke or contribute to. And as a result, our countries find themselves in this continuous cycle of repair and recovery. No sooner have we recovered from one storm, another one comes along. The unfortunate reality is that the current pledges of greenhouse gas emission reduction, current pledges and targets on the table will result in a global mean temperature increase of somewhere between 2.1 and 3.3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. If we were to look at not the pledges, but the policies that the various countries have in place, the increase is going to be even greater. It's going to be between 2.1 and 3.9 degrees Celsius. These scenarios are catastrophic for small island developing states. I mean, quite apart from the 1.5 report that was commissioned by the UNFCCC, we have work that's been done in various places. For example, in the Caribbean, Professor Michael Taylor and his team at the University of the West Indies has shown that the 2.5 degrees Celsius warming will result in anywhere between a 15 and a 25% reduction in precipitation and an intensification of drying in the Southern Caribbean. And this is for countries that, in the best of times, go through a water deficit situation in the first half of the year. Over 200 days being excessively warm, up to 6 fewer intense rainfall days. So all of these scenarios are very catastrophic. And I remember looking at the 2008 study on the cost of global inaction on climate change on the Caribbean. And that study showed that by 2025, the negative impact on regional GDP would be 5%. By 2050, this would increase to a little over 10%. And by the end of the century, the impact would be 21.7%. That's a 2008 study. If the study had to be redone today, I'm sure these numbers would be much larger. So for SIDS, COP26 really has to deliver on two very important goals, in addition to finalizing the Paris rulebook. The first one is that we must get very firm commitments from developed countries to urgently and dramatically curb the emissions of greenhouse gases to put us on track for no more than a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming by the end of this century. Last year, with the unprecedented shutdowns in the global economy as a result of COVID-19, I think we had, a 7% reduction in emissions of carbon dioxide. 2020 was still the hottest year that we've recorded. So it shows you the kind of intense decarbonization that must take place if we are to get down to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we're not seeing that. You know, the World Meteorological Organization recently said that we will reach 1.5 degrees in the next 5 years. And that's very, very ominous for countries like mine So we really must leave COP26 with an understanding and an unequivocal commitment by developing countries to undertake urgent decarbonization of their economies. Secondly, and Isabella referred to this in her opening statement, we must increase the financial flows to SIDS and other climate vulnerable countries. There was an adaptation gap report that was done by the United Nations Environment Programme last year, and it stated that the annual adaptation costs in developing countries are currently in the range of $70 billion US. It's going to reach between 140 to 300 billion dollars by 2030, and between 280 and 500 billion dollars in 2050. So we really must capitalize the Green Climate Fund and the other climate finance instruments like the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environment Facilities. We are too slow in capitalizing them. We must mobilize both public and private finance. Otherwise, small island developing states, climate vulnerable countries, low-lying countries will not be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change, and those impacts are becoming increasingly severe. That's why today's vote in the House of Commons is so important to increase Britain's ODA contribution. As the host of COP26, the United Kingdom must demonstrate that it is willing and ready, literally, to put its money where its mouth is. This will speak very seriously to the credibility of the UK at COP26. You can't be chairing COP26 if you're saying one thing, but on the other hand, you are reducing the assistance you're providing to the countries that are most vulnerable to climate change. I'd just like to end with an echo of what Isabella said. Political will and the spirit of multilateralism. These are very important in having a successful COP process. It has to be party driven. It has to be very clear that the parties are the ones driving the process. You have to understand where the anxieties and the disagreements exist, and you have to work transparently to address them. And Isabella could not be more correct in her conclusion that this is about dialogue, dialogue, dialogue. We have to know there are people who come to COP, unfortunately, with the sole intention of ensuring that there is not much progress. Those people exist, those countries exist, because really what we're working towards will have consequences for them in the short term. What we have to do is to get them to understand that in the long term, the entire country, the entire planet, benefits. And that's why this transparent, multi-party and party-driven process is so important. So, the imperatives of small island developing states and that we must work towards are, for me, finance flows and greater access to finance, very serious commitments to global greenhouse gas emission reductions, and really to understand that for countries like mine, for countries like Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, the Philippines, Guyana, Fiji, climate change is not an esoteric academic discussion. It's an existential threat. It's a life and death situation that we live every single day, particularly during our hurricane season. And we have to see the COP has to treat it that way. It's not something where we can come every year and get involved in these discussions where we're splitting hair over text, and people are suffering and lives are at risk. And I think that really is the message that we must get across in COP26. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. A really, really important reminder that we should keep repeating about just what is at stake. And I think we'll come back in after this to what we can learn from the run up to the Paris agreement. I think in terms of managing that process. But before that, let's go over next to Richie.
Thank you, Gareth, and thank you to Prasek for this opportunity to talk to where Australia might place itself in the lead up to COP26. And I think talking specifically to Australia, because you have such esteemed panelists with deep experience in terms of how to shape the broader dialogue, I'll talk more to Jimmy's last point about some of the countries that go to the COP without a real interest in seeing progress. Because I think Australia, as an old boss of mine told me, who was the special envoy for climate, has waxed and waned with such amplitude more than other countries in terms of its position. It was the 9th country to ratify the UN Convention, but didn't send its prime minister to Rio. It lobbied hard for a baseline and an increase in emissions in the first Kyoto period, and then didn't even ratify Kyoto. Australia was crucial to the development of the Green Climate Fund. Australia was the longest serving co-chair. At the same time, an Australian was appointed as the executive director, and then Australia pulled out and is now the only developed country not involved in the Green Climate Fund. So Australia really vacillates. And I think to some degree, it's because a number of Australian governments have seen national interest when it comes to climate change alongside fossil fuel interests. Australia's emissions are larger than 40 countries with larger populations. Australia's emissions are larger than the UK or France or Italy. And those are just the domestic emissions. Australia is the largest exporter of coal, the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. When you put that together, Australia is the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world after Russia and Saudi Arabia. And it has plans to continue to grow that. And so really its interest is in trying to export and exploit fossil fuels for as long as possible. It's why Australia has not committed to net zero by 2050. It's why Australia has not increased its 2030 nationally determined contribution, which it put forward in 2014. And so really, if you are going to try and bring some of the laggards to the table, then it has to be through a show of direct force. It has to be targeted and specific. And where that occurs, it works. We saw that when President Obama came to Australia, when Australia hosted the G20 in 2014, and specifically spoke to the Australian experience, and specifically spoke to where Australia was at. And we saw a real change in the Australian approach, which led to a far more constructive engagement in Paris. The same as well when Prime Minister Boris Johnson had invited Australia to speak at the December Climate Ambition Summit, and then withdrew that offer of speaking, given Australia was not willing to put any further ambition on the table. That had an impact. Shortly after, Australia changed its approach to how we'll meet its Paris Agreement target. So clearly targeted shows of force work, especially from key allies and like-minded countries like the United Kingdom, like the United States. Where it doesn't work is where Australia can sit on the margins. And a good example is when Australia was invited to Cornwall to the G7 as part of the G7 Plus. So all G7 countries had increased their 2030 target, all had locked in net zero by 2050, all had agreed not to finance core projects overseas, and Australia was invited as a guest, and Australia committed to none of those things. And in fact, it was seen as a success by the Australian government not to have committed to any of those things, attending and not being pushed into actually agreeing to those things. So unless there is a clear targeted action on countries like Australia, then they will try and find ways to be creative about not committing. And they are creative. Australia has a number of capable negotiators that have negotiated deals in the UNFCCC that have worked very well for it. One example was obviously negotiating a 108% target under the first Kyoto period. So one of only 3 countries to negotiate an increase. Then the second period only negotiated a decrease of 0.5%. It had such a large amount of leftover credits from Kyoto, it tried to use those credits to avoid having to reduce any emissions over the next 10 years. And it was only because of the strong show of force that eventually Australia reneged and agreed that maybe it shouldn't do that, something that is actually legally baseless, or as Christiana Figueira is called, cheating. So the last point I'll make is, whilst it might seem sensible to point out that maybe Australia might be interested in saving the Great Barrier Reef, this hasn't worked to date. In fact, when UNESCO is potentially listing the Great Barrier Reef as in danger under the World Heritage Conventions, Australia claimed that actually it was more concerned with the fact that it had been blindsided by this decision, and it could have potentially had that China could have been involved in influencing this decision. It was far more concerned with the politics of this rather than the actual reality, which is that most scientists agree that the Great Barrier Reef will be all but gone under a 2-degree scenario. So it seems to be more concerned with managing the politics of climate and climate diplomacy than it is the actual substance. I mean, the last example is when we were all in Madrid, and those who were still involved in the process for their sins, when we were all in Madrid, Australia was literally on fire through massive bushfires, and Australia's representative to the COP during the plenary statement did not mention the bushfires at all. In fact, the Australian Prime Minister went on holiday during the bushfires, and the Deputy Prime Minister claimed it was anything but climate change that was supercharging those bushfires. So whilst it might seem sensible to point out the impacts to Australia, it hasn't worked to date. Our recommendation from experience is a very clear targeted show of force to bring it to the table, and the UK is very well placed to do that if it feels like expending the capital to do so. And the majority of Australians do support stronger action on climate change beyond what the Australian government has put forward. So it would align as well with what many Australian jurisdictions and people want. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Dialogue through to a targeted show of force. We're really moving this now. Can I start by just asking a couple of questions of the panel before we go to questions that are starting to come in on the Q&A box and on the chat, and please do put other questions there. First thing I just wanted to ask you, Jimmy, about that sort of that process of getting past, of getting to those commitments, of getting past the people who are slowing progress. Can you talk a little bit about your experience working with the French presidency in 2015 in the run-up to the Paris Agreement, and what lessons that might give the UK presidency in terms of the sort of thing that Richie is talking about in influencing, and the sort of thing that Isabella is talking about in turbocharging that multilateralism?
Okay. Unfortunately, you don't have the luxury of time that the French had, because the French really embarked on a year-long process of climate diplomacy. I think Isabella was and Brazil were very much a part of this. Laura Fabius, who was the president of the COP, convened a series of informal ministerials in Paris leading up to the COP. So the first one was in July of 2015. The second one, I think, was in September. And the third one was a pre-COP sometime around October. And what he did was he brought together select countries to discuss certain issues. So each informal ministerial dealt with 2 or 3 issues, be it adaptation, finance, or whatever. And I think that allowed the French to get a sense of the temperature of the room. Who were the important players? Who were the naysayers? Who were the people who were really being problematic? And also to get a sense of who were the ministers, who were the reasonable people, the people like Isabella and others who you could put into a process to help the presidency to arrive at a mediated position where the Paris Agreement was concerned. And I think that is extremely important. Now, unfortunately, COVID has not allowed you that luxury of having that series of discussions and to really get to understand who you're working with. Fortunately, however, I think you know who they are. I mean, as Richie said, we know who the naysayers are. We know who the people who come. I remember together with the Minister of the Environment of Norway, Tina Sundtoft, I chaired the ministerial dialogue on ambition that created the 1.5 and everything else that's in the Paris Agreement. And at the end of one bilateral session, one of the chief negotiators came to me and menacingly pointed at me and said, "You will get 1.5 degrees over my dead body." I mean, you know, those are the kinds of emotions that you get. Yet, I had another head of delegation come to me and say, "Look, I really sympathize with small island developing states over 1.5 degrees Celsius, but you have to understand what this means to us. We are a major livestock producer, and to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius would mean significant changes to our economy, because we would now have to make changes to our livestock sector. But we're willing to work with you. Let's see how we can make this happen." So those are the types of things that take place during a COP. And that's what you have to understand. But the most important thing is to ensure that it is country driven and that there are no back agreements taking place. One of the reasons Copenhagen was so dramatically unsuccessful is because when things started falling apart, the deals started taking place in back rooms, and you heard of President Obama coming in and having discussions, and many parties feel aggrieved by that. Even if the end is a good one, the means have to justify it, and you can't freeze parties out. In the UNFCCC process, every party has an equal vote. It doesn't matter whether you are a Marshall Islands or you are the United States of America. We are all seen as equal in this process, and in fact, the Marshall Islands stand much more to lose than the United States of America. So I think one of the challenges for your presidency is to keep it country driven, but to understand that there are naysayers. I'm very happy Richie was so forthcoming with Australia. I have my own personal experiences with the then Minister of the Environment and Climate Change from Australia, Greg Hunt. And I mean, we had to we had to employ some very devious tactics in the end to get Greg to agree to a commitment that he had made to support 1.5. He reneged on that agreement, and we had to do a few things like calling in the Sydney Morning Herald and saying that Australia has agreed to committed to supporting 1.5, which then backed Greg into a corner, and he had no choice but to publicly support 1.5. So, you know, there are things that take place in a COP. Not all of them are nice. And you have to be prepared to do some of the dirty work behind the scenes, because you will get people who are very intransigent and who will ensure that there is no agreement. But I think the important thing is to keep it country driven and to never let the doors of dialogue close. You must keep that dialogue going, even when it seems like we had one or two times, and I'm sure Isabella would bear me out on that, one or two times in Paris that it looked like we would not get an agreement. There was one particular Indaba that took place, I think, on a Thursday night, and I left there at 4 a.m. thinking, oh gosh, this is unraveling. But the French never stopped. They just kept the dialogue going, and I think that's what's important for you.
Thank you. One of the questions that we've had is one of the questions that I would like to ask. It was something that Richie alluded to in terms of Australian public support for climate action. Isabella, I wonder if this is in terms of that sort of targeted country action that Jimmy and Richie have talked about. I wonder if this is a factor in relation to Brazil. There's a sense that there was a sense at the Biden summit in April that Bolsonaro was turning up having lost a friend in the White House. I wonder what the impact of that, what you think the impact of that is, and Brazilian public support for climate action is in terms of that sort of targeted country action.
Oh, it's a good question. First of all, I'd like to fully agree with James, what he reported, explaining better what's happening in Paris. And this is very important to understand of what that to have COVID crisis, okay? You cannot forget it. But it's very important. That's why I highlight before the importance of dialogue. Dialogue. Everyone is important. Everyone. Don't forget it, okay? Everyone. Because everybody likes to be recognized. It's like when I meet you, I know your name, you are so proud that I can mention your name, okay? This is also in negotiation. This is part of the credibility. It's a part of the leadership, okay? This is my first point. The second point, I mentioned about Brazil soon. The second point here, it's very important to understand, as I mentioned before, it's not only before and during the COP, it's after and beyond us. Okay, this is why we discuss international cooperation and also multilateral system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a good example to illustrate this, when you go into the Amazon region, for example, the countries that are part of the Amazon basin, they are middle-income countries. But Amazon regions in these countries are low-income countries. The indicators are related to low-income countries. So when you go into international lands, we cannot see this. We can only see the middle-income countries. So you have barriers that are very important to be removed and to play in innovative ways. This is a clear example how leadership, international cooperation must play innovative roles to address concrete solution climate agenda. If not, it's only postpone. Let's see what's happening in Brazil, okay? And Brazil used to be a strategic player, considering not only the Brazilian society, but also the government. What you have today in Brazil is a wicked situation, a wicked picture, if I can use the expression between quotes, okay? Because we have the full engagement of Brazilian society, and also subnational players like governors of states that want to address concrete solutions on climate change. And that's why this segment of this part of the Brazilian society put pressure on the government of Bolsonaro to address a new position on Biden summit. Okay, that's why you have the full engagement of Brazilian civil society with Americans in bilateral dialogue, exactly to make clear, don't believe what they are looking for to address or put on the table, because it's not necessarily the priorities. It's very important that Brazil should be committed, well committed, to address concrete solutions in climate change, as Brazil did in 2015. So it's clear that to have different positions here when it comes to Brazilian society and to go to other subnational players and to go to Bolsonaro government. What's happening in Bolsonaro government? This is something also wicked, because Bolsonaro and part of his team, they are climate negationists, okay? Don't forget it. So this is not a key agenda for the guys. But it doesn't mean that for economic sectors, into the public policies, they are not interested to address this. Agriculture sector, for example, we have a new plan on low carbon agriculture now. I'm not sure if it is good or not, because you don't have political dialogue with society to build process with a robust conviction that we are in the right direction. It's the same when to go into the energy sector. Energy sector in Brazil today, you know that our energy mix will have a comfortable situation. Okay, you have more than 84% of share of renewable, 84% of share of renewable in Brazilian electricity mix, for example. So we compare to the other countries, the numbers is impressive because OECD is 27%. So it's very important today in energy sector, they are exactly with the scenarios working in the next 10 years planning, working with low carbon scenarios and how do we indeed replace fossil fuels, okay? Because the fossil fuels put pressure on our transport system, okay? This is not in the electricity systems. Also, when you go into that zero, that was Biden summit commitment, the energy sector in Brazil today have the scenarios for to be net zero by 2050. They're really working hard to propose this, and also for land use considered agriculture and forest sector, they're looking for to address until 2030. Why this is not mentioned in the negotiation? Why this is not clear? Because we have two trick situations. The one is the setbacks on deforestation in Amazonia, something that's unacceptable because this is based on illegality, this is based on environmental crime. This is a setback, okay? Brazil knows how to manage this, knows how to solve these problems, and unfortunately, the political guidelines that we have today to address or to tackle deforestation, the outcomes are not good. They're really bad ones, and means that we have setbacks. This is something that we need to address. This is law enforcement. We need to have transparency. We need to understand what's happening, no go against science. The other side is that, unfortunately, Brazil doesn't have any strategies, as it had in the past, to address our NDCs, to know what are the trade-offs that we need to face, to understand better what are our national interests and how you can put this together at the international level. That's why you have this weak situation, because you have a political leadership from the federal government that brings contradictions to the international negotiation process. And don't forget that also this government was until recently not clear consider the multilateral arrangements, but absolutely against this. And that's why you have civil society and the economic sector, private sector, financial sector, everyone's playing together to looking for to address concrete solutions. But this is not enough, because at international level, you have the federal government under the leadership. My last comment, we have a fragmented picture in Brazil today. If I can use the expression, if you allow me, you have this fragmented because also Bolsonaro governments closed all the political rooms to dialogue with civil society, all of them. The environmental governance in Brazil, the climate governance and environmental governance in Brazil, unfortunately, is not the same in the past. And also consider the climate diplomacy that used to be one of the best in the world. Unfortunately, the new institutional arrangements in Itamaraty downsized the importance of climate agenda into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brazil. So you have different initiatives, different pictures that when you bring together, it's not enough to address concrete solutions, to have the leadership that Brazil had in the past. So what's happening in Brazil today is political guidelines, political guidance from the president and his staff that this is not a priority. And that's why you have some mistakes, for example, when they're looking to address or to block negotiation in Article 6, when you mix markets and public finance, or you will try to address concrete solutions to promote forest preservation, this doesn't mean mitigation additionality. This means that you need a new strategy to pay for stand-up forests, because this is important for climate security. It's not only to carbon storage. So we have this misunderstanding. And unfortunately, I think that for UK president, my last comment, I know that I don't have my time, it's absolutely important to be closer to some other players in Brazil, like National Congress, that are looking for today to address concrete measures or concrete agenda to COP26, and also to influence the Brazilian national climate policy. This is very important to understand, and in such a way that we can be back soon, I hope so, as a global climate leader. I do believe in this. I will be back. I promise.
Good, thank you. One of the other you've variously alluded to, and particularly you, Richie, alluded to the sort of the fossil fuel interests of the state itself. One of the questions that we've had is about the role of leading fossil fuel companies in all of this, including their presence at the COP. I wonder if you have a view about how worried you are about their continued presence at the COP in the context of Australia's position as a leading fossil fuel state.
Me?
Yeah, I mean,
I know. So Richie,
yeah.
sorry.
Richard, sorry.
Look, there are a number of fossil fuel observers. They've been intimately involved in the UN process from day one. And this is well documented now. They continue to show in force. Oftentimes, fossil fuel companies will find ways to actually procure party badges and be represented as government representatives. Sometimes this is overt, and sometimes this is more subtle. But I think the broader influence as well, though, is the fact that the fossil fuel interests are often manifested in country policies before they even get there. And so it's just really being quite clear about how you manage the countries who are the ones ultimately in the room, who are going to be promoting what is not ultimately in the best interest and not in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And to do that, you need to kind of have those strong countries involved, as Jimmy referred to, who can shepherd a process where there is sufficient dialogue, but at the same time, a clear objective at the end of it that is aligned with the science rather than aligned with fossil fuel interests. It's a tough ask, but at the same time, there's opportunities to, one, find ways to ring fence those conversations. So, for example, we know that a number of Gulf states in particular push for a lot of work around the impact of response measures. So this is basically, how do you pay for the impacts to fossil fuel companies and countries that benefit from them, who won't be able to sell as much fossil fuels in a carbon constrained world. Ring fence that conversation in a separate work stream so it doesn't pollute and dilute the other work streams, like on ambition, like on finance, like on adaptation, is one way to do it. And the second is ultimately figuring out ways to ensure that there are the right transparency measures around ultimately who is going to be speaking and who's going to be working behind the scenes. I think Glasgow will be particularly difficult because of COVID, because numbers might be limited. And if it's seen that fossil fuel companies are still present and still influencing, whilst many observers that are from, say, the not-for-profit sector, or from science, or from unions, or from youth aren't able to attend, then that will, I think, only make it trickier for the UK to manage that. So I think in how you approach observers and give observers space, you should be cognizant of the fact that already people are quite wary of the influence of fossil fuel industries in the past and what will look like to come.
So in terms of the, thank you, in terms of, you made reference to obviously the UK's role in managing this. One of the questions that we have here, given some of the comments that you've each made about the approach that needs to be taken by the presidency to this, do you as panelists, do you as seasoned observers in this space, do you have faith in the UK government that it will be able to stand up to problem countries and manage these processes, for example, in relation to observers in the way that you described? But also, just managing the process of the tricky issues that the COP needs to deal with. Jimmy, can I start with you?
I think the good thing for the UK government is that it doesn't have to invent the process. This is a process that's been going on for a while now. It's backstopped by a very competent UNFCCC secretariat that is very aware of what needs to be done, how a COP should be managed, who are the problems, and who are the people who can facilitate. You also have the UN Secretary General. In our time, it was Ban Ki-moon, but this current Secretary General has demonstrated just as firm a commitment to addressing climate change issues. So the UK government is not doing this alone. While it is, yes, the president of the COP, but it has a good team around it. However, a lot of emphasis and a lot of focus is still on the presidency of the COP and how the presidency manages it. And I think the signals that are sent by the UK government leading up to the COP are very important. And again, I go back to what's taking place in the House of Commons today. that can undermine the UK's credibility. Because if you are now going into a COP as a president of a COP, where one of the big issues, particularly for the countries that are most impacted by climate change, is the issue of finance, yet you are not making a commitment on your own to increase finance to climate vulnerable countries, then that's a problem. If you are not making a commitment to reduce on the influence of fossil fuel companies, and that point Richie made, I had not actually thought about it, but it's an extremely important one. In a COP where attendance is going to be limited, you will have some countries, I mean, not just observers, but you will have some parties that will not be represented in the numbers because they just have not yet had access to vaccines. So the optics of a COP where you have some climate vulnerable countries not participating or not participating in the numbers that they would like, yet you're seeing a very strong presence of fossil fuel companies, that it doesn't matter what you come up with at that COP, that already undermines the credibility of the presidency and the process. So I have confidence that the British government can manage this process, that the UK government can manage this process, and I have confidence in the Prime Minister. But I think a lot depends on what is done from today onward, what statements are made, how the UK presidency reaches out to partners. Like, fortunately, the UK presidency is not operating in a period where Donald Trump is the president of the United States of America. It's operating in a period where Joe Biden, who has demonstrated a very strong commitment. So, and that's one of the UK's strongest allies. So I think the UK has to use its allies. Barack Obama was a very strong ally to the French in the lead up to COP21. He went and he visited Xi Jinping in China. He visited Modi in India. And he embarked on his own tour of climate diplomacy that was very important in ensuring that there was momentum leading up to COP21. And I think the UK presidency has to do the same thing. It has to lean on its allies and see where it can develop that momentum. In Paris, we formed what was called the High Ambition Coalition. And that grew out of a very modest group of countries that came together after the first informal ministerial, basically spurred on by my now deceased colleague, Tony de Bruyn, the former foreign minister of the Marshall Islands. But what the High Ambition Coalition did was it brought in countries that were all committed to an ambitious agreement in Paris. So, we started off with just the EU and a few small island developing states, but very soon Canada came on board. And I'm very happy to hear what Isabella said, because it reminds me of what Catherine McKenna said at the first meeting she attended, when she said Canada is back, because Canada up until that time had been one of the problems, and Canada came on board. So I think what Boris Johnson and the UK presidency need to do is to really get a coalition of the willing, a coalition of countries that are very serious about driving this process, and it has to ensure that particularly the climate vulnerable countries are part of that coalition.
Thank you. Isabella, what about you? How confident are you in the UK presidency?
I fully agree with James, and I used to be an optimist, but a pragmatic woman, okay? I learned a lot with politics and climate politics, and I used to believe that people come together to bring solutions, not only to discuss problems. This is a critical momentum for the world, not only because of climate crisis, but because we have COVID crisis. And what it means, that vulnerability and risks will be key words that we should address in this century. We are coming with the climate and the digital ages together, and we're discussing what kind of citizenship will emerge from this. Okay, it's very important to understand how COVID shows to us, for example, social inequalities and social vulnerabilities and economic informality. Okay, but how we can move forward, consider the global crisis, and how indeed the importance of what leadership means in this century. It's not only share funds, it's not only to translate this in power, because climate is a geopolitical issue today. It's more than this. We need to convince people to be together. We need to show how the issues are interconnected. We need to recognize our mistakes. As Brazil, for me as a Brazilian player, it's unbelievable to see what's happened today in my country, consider this agenda, okay? It is never in my bad dream, never was able to think about this. Okay, but it is happening. It's happened in the United States also. I used to discuss with my friends, my American friends, and say, yes, go ahead, be strong. I'm doing my best. But what we say here is that leadership means to bring people together, to be an open-minded behavior, to understand the demands, to understand, even if you have a country that is not an important carbon emitter, et cetera, it's very important to understand what they are looking for to address. It's not only funds, it's also technologies, it's also be part of. Everyone wants to be part of the solutions groups, not of the problem groups. And they used to manage this in the bad times, in insufficient ways in the past. My feeling is that for your leadership, after Brexit, that somebody mentioned here, it's important that you can understand what UK wants in this center, in this momentum after COP26. It's not only during COP26, it's after. It's very important to understand what are the new alliances that are coming, what are the new criteria that you like to address global crisis, and more than this, avoid some situations, or try to understand some situations like nature-based solutions, as an asset for fossil fuels industry, for example. We need to discuss nature-based solutions. This is an open concept today in the world. It's the same on net zero by 2050. Everybody agrees, but not necessarily have a common understanding what are the key challenges that we need to face. We need to avoid green protectionism. We need to avoid greenwashing. We need to avoid the bad guys into the room. And I hope that the UK can be positive in a way to show that we are looking forward to address these global problems into new perspectives, new political perspectives, new looks, new lens to address concrete solutions. This is very important for me, but I'm confident. I will be in Glasgow, I hope so. Okay, and as James mentioned, don't forget the role of the Secretariat.
Yeah.
Very important, and also the role of the United Nations, not only the Patricia Espinosa, but also the Secretary General. It's very important to bring people together and to have an open dialogue all the time to understand what you want and how we can do things that we want. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you. And I'd like to provoke you to provoke this dialogue with Brazilian Congress here to discuss how we can be closer and how we can be together in Glasgow, because I know that the congressmen in Brazil will come to Glasgow. It's very important to understand the role of the parliament in the world to move forward in climate ambitions. Thank you very much for this. James, nice to see you again. Okay, my friend. And also Rich, very, very important to meet you today. Thank you.
But just before you finish.
No, I'm here because I don't have time. I'm here.
But just before you finish us off completely as well, I mean, thank you for all those thank yous. And a really important point about how parliaments can work together. That's an important point for obviously UK parliamentarians over the next few months as well. But just to check in with you as well, Richie, partly on that sort of confidence in the UK presidency, but also, you know, that in the context of one of our other questions, which is around those tricky issues around things like leftover credit from Kyoto and CDM carryover, which you referred to as being something where Australia has been a blocker.
Oh, in the past.
Sorry, I just wanted to check in with Richie very quickly.
Please, Richie, sorry. I always like to block. I want to block Richie.
No, I know. I love hearing from you, Bella.
That's Brazil looking for to block Australia, please.
Blockers blocking.
Australia, you have the floor.
Thank you. Look, there are some serious issues, intractable issues, like how they'll land Article 6, particularly around the carryover, both of leftover credits from Kyoto, but then also the CDM credits as well. I think this is something the UK could potentially land. A lot of good backroom negotiations with the countries that have a strong interest would help land, you know, what is ultimately a technical issue. And there are good options on the table to land something. That's just good shuttle diplomacy that the UK is very capable of doing. And that would be a good sign, having a technical win. But I think the bigger picture is people are going to be looking for a more ambitious, easy to understand win. And that is basically increasing NDCs, like increasing those 2030 targets. That's what really set the Biden Ambition Summit, you know, out large, is that you had countries like Japan, like Canada come forward and increase their targets. The more people that increase their targets in the next 10 years, I think is really going to help bolster the UK as a leader in this space. But then there's also, building off Jimmy's point, other coalitions that they could build. So the UK and Canada launching the Powering Past Coal Alliance, I think, is a good example of something quite simple, basically tackling fossil fuels and coal head on. The Secretary General has said that we need to phase out of coal in the next 10 years in terms of power generation, and developed countries should lead. The UK is very well placed as the birthplace of coal to demonstrate how you do that, and using itself as a case study and then building a coalition from that. And the final thing is to be careful around net zero by 2050. While it is great to see so many countries sign up, while it is great to have the race to zero, some countries like Australia will say, yep, sure, we'll sign up to net zero by 2050 and then do nothing over the next 20 years. Right? There is a real risk that will mean not tailing down fossil fuels now. And that's what we ultimately have to do, cut down fossil fuels now. We can't have a transition if we keep growing the problem. And certainly in our corner of the world, the problem is still growing. So I think there's some good coalition building that the UK could really lead, and also demonstrate its own example moving past coal itself.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. We are at time. It is now 3 o'clock. Well, it's 3 o'clock in the UK. It's all sorts of other times in Brazil, St. Lucia and Australia. So let me firstly, most importantly, thank our panelists, Isabella Teixeira, Jimmy Fletcher and Richie Merzian, for joining us from your respective time zones and sharing the richness of your perspective and experience. We really, really appreciate it. It's been a very rich conversation, and it's one that we will share more widely after this as well. Thank you to those of you who joined us on Zoom and those of you who've been watching on YouTube. And we will, as I say, be sharing this further. So, you know, tell your friends. But thank you very much indeed, everyone, for joining us. And thank you again, panelists.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. See you.
Thank you,
See you in
Glasgow.
I hope so. Bye-bye.
You in Glasgow, yes.
Yes.
Yep, bye.